Okay, 28 November, Turkey Day. Welcome to Dis and Dat, and I'm going to look at today material that I actually kind of went over a couple of years ago. I've just only noticed that guerrilla history has been around for 4 years, which means technically we've been our little group here is sort of, until the uh, the separation. We've been doing this for a while. Anyway, yesterday I introduced the comparison from Volume One, Marx's Capital, Karl Marx's Capital, with the Princeton translation, and I was using Appendix A, which compares three of the different versions: Marx's first German edition, the second German edition, which is the basis for the Princeton translation, the French translation, which is also some elements are used, and Folks's English translation from 1976. So it's useful just simply to see laterally what the differences are. Some things don't change. Um, some things are altered and added to because it was important to Marx to try and fill in some of the stuff and sort of front load some of the new things that he was working on. You will recall that a couple of days ago we were looking at the Grundrisse, which, because it occurs a decade earlier, that you just sort of want to think about what's going on. That Marx says these original initial ideas that become further developed. That is the difference in between a relative and absolute surplus value, and then other elements that because he does return to some things like Ricardo, et cetera. And yesterday and the day before that, I've included different approaches to the issue of rent, and I've tried to remind you that Ricardo's theory of rent is what Marx is responding to. Um, Ricardo's view is a little bit mechanical or sort of one dimensional in that sense, whereas Marx includes the idea of differential rents, which he doesn't really load a lot of into the volume one, but he eventually gets there. And it's important because it informs a variety of research and some interesting ideas that we can still use to this day. That is that surplus value on the one hand has a relation to labor. On the other hand, it's about something else, and I'm going to talk about that today. That um, it's something I've mentioned before. The idea that you know how, or the question you might want to ask is how material is a sign. And if we assume that there is something called a sign that is not simply a placard that tells you where the street is, but rather um, something that signifies, that is, that can be seen as not only a signifier, that is something that is more like an object, but doesn't have to be an object. It could be, a gesture, or in language, it could be a performative. For example, if you make an oath, and that's one of the political elements that I think we're currently involved in that a speech act that is an oath, like an oath to the state, to the Constitution, or to Trump, dear leader himself. Um, all of those oaths are, you know, uh, there. It's language. It's oral. You sort of you um, the Nazis, had a ceremony where you pledged your loyalty to dear leader, and the act of making that promise, it's like marriage or certain other kinds of oath or promises. If you promise to meet someone somewhere, that has a little bit more force or power to it because you've made a contract, as it were, between someone else that you're going to coordinate your activity and sort of wind up in the same place. Relationships have been won or lost over those things. And I don't mean to digress too much, but the point I'm trying to make is it would seem that a performative, that is something where you promise to go somewhere or that you swear an oath to someone that has a certain materiality to it. And you can use that as an example of a kind of material sign. While you don't have a specific object, um, the obligation or the contract it has that certain materiality to it. Now, I'm not saying that that's um, necessarily the equivalent, and of course we know this if you've taken contract law or whatever that ultimately there's still other issues at work in the formation of contracts. But it's still there. It's not like it disappears. It's part of the code of capital if you really want to get down to trying to measure that stuff. So anyway, that's the example that we sort of are gleaning from all of this fiddling around. And so I'm gonna sort of backtrack and go. It's not so much backtrack. Some of you may have heard my other little. I did actually a thing on this. I don't know, a year ago, I guess, yammering on about semiotics, and I think I've got it a little better worked out. Just like I tried to just a second ago tried to say, well, pragmatically speaking, or performatively speaking, there's a certain type uh, of speaking or language act that has a little bit more materiality or force to it, that is more transactional, that is more obligatory, or that is more political or social, than just simply a regular conventional discourse. Hi, how are you? Blah 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 blah. Small talk. Blah blah blah. Um, that is, certain performatives can be seen as having material reality. Just like if you have oral contracts of any kind, I promise to pay you blah blah for today's work, and they try to rip you off. Well, I didn't say that. This is where it becomes problematic, and if you've ever been in a uh, bureaucratic work, oftentimes people will try to hold you to things that you just say as though um, that carried a certain type of obligation. And I learned far too early on that I always have to watch what I say and also document everything that I do, because people hold you to the weirdest things, and you have to remind yourself, no, I really didn't say that. This is what I said. Um, and you can get in a lot of trouble with all these things. So we're looking at volume one, Karl Marx, Capital, the Princeton translation by the Pauls, um, Paul North and Paul Reiter. Um, and I've just been including some elements. These are from most of these today. There are just only a couple from the editor's introduction. Um, and I think there's one from the translator's introduction. So I'll read that, and then I'll begin a thing on uh, the Greimas semiotic square. Now, why that's important is because what the semiotic square does is a tool to identify certain elements of things that actually could be performative, that is actually have the materiality of a sign. The fact that there are actually sets of oppositions or differences make it more material. That is, if you're asserting in a statement or a comment, just from a logical point of view, one thing, you sort of are implying that it's not something else, or that it has some relation to something else. And that assertion, that is from the front end, from the proposition, is a kind of material act. Um, I mean, it's obviously better if you have a tape recorder on, or, whatever, video on or something. But if you're having a conversation or you have an exchange with any other person, or you're doing this within the social or public context, that's kind of what it means. And it is that set of transformations or exchanges that help establish the or address the thing that we've been looking at for a couple of weeks, and that is, how is it that we can get to big V value? What are the things that indicate that we have a series of exchange value that help create big V value? Um, it's not simply about use value, which is pragmatic, certainly. That is that it's stuff that you use or that you consume or whatever. But the reality, of course, as Heinrich et al. Have sort of talked about, it's not about that. It's really about the commodity stuff. That is, when you sit in a market, or you have a kind of market exchange of one kind or another. That doesn't mean you have to be face to face. I mean, you can do this on the phone or whatever. That it can be mediated in a variety of ways, and that in the future is going to become more problematic as we proceed further more digitally. It's my understanding that scammers have a way by which, in a phone conversation, they can actually contractually obligate you to things if you just say the word yes. Um, I saw a reference to something like that, that poor, old people are being scammed at, unfortunate rates with this kind of stuff. It's not, conning old people into go, buying uh, money cards or whatever, but rather actually just simply making the obligation in a conversational act, which is pretty frightening, particularly for older people. So anyway, Marx reimagined the project several times. That is capital, and so for one thing, capital is peculiar because there's no single finished version of the whole. That is, it's peculiar because it's incomplete. On one hand, it's incomplete because it's unfinished. On the other hand, it is incomplete because the project is essentially incomplete. That is always, it's going to be forever incomplete. The method was constantly under construction, and the object of study kept eluding him and changing as he learned more about it, and changing because one of capital's chief characteristics, identified by Marx, is to be in constant savage change, angry or antagonistic um, interaction and change in multiple dimensions all the time. No book can completely capture its complexities and its shifting modes and practices. Now, people would simply love to have this be a perfectly denotative document on the one hand, from a Marxist point of view. On the other hand, that's just not possible. We have a dynamic, constantly changing world in the 21st century. Marx, on the one hand, could not predict certain things, but the argument that we're trying to make here is that what he did think about is actually sufficient for arguing that um, people get exploited, expropriation does occur, alienation and estrangement occur, and it's not that different. The estrangement, or the having to deal with stupid people hasn't changed from the 19th to the 21st century, which I think we can see in the last election. Only the first volume of Capital was published under the guidance of Marx himself. The books published as volumes 2 and 3, which contain investigations and arguments, is crucial for understanding the capital system, as any in volume 1 were valiantly collated from different manuscripts and edited with great care. And many good editorial decisions by Engels during the last decade of his life. For volume 1, Marx brought 2 German editions of it into print, plus a translation into French that he was directly involved in. So I showed you these 4 columns of the different things, the 2 versions in German, the 1 version in French, and then the sort of English version that we're sort of upgrading. Translations into English to date have taken only the 3rd and 4th editions, edited and collated by Engels as their sources. See, that's where the problem is, that it's a translation or a telephone problem where some of the meanings get kind of lost as you kind of do later translation. It's very hard to see the collations and edits that Engels made, however, in those editions and the translations made from them without extensive study. And for this reason, the current edition, that is this Princeton edition, takes Marx's second German edition as its basis with reference to the now canonical changes in the French edition in an appendix. There's an additional appendix on the French edition, and in an afterword by William Clare Roberts. Now, William Clare Roberts, let's see, where the hell is he? See at York in Canada, York University in Canada. He's somewhere. And or he might actually be in America. But anyway, he's the guy who did the thing on comparing Dante's Inferno to Marx's Capital. At the same time, Capital contains many formulations where a measure of strong translation is called for, thanks to Marx's compressive tendencies, where Marx, what I think Reiter is doing here is talking about certain issues that occur in translation, and I guess translation from German. I'm not a German philologist or whatever, but it seems to me that German linguistics is structured in such a way that meaning sort of compresses at the front end of a sentence or whatever, and so you sort of have to get this sense of what its meaning is as it sort of unwinds towards the end of the sentence. Where Marx introduces his concept of value, for example, he writes about labor products that, as values, are, and I mentioned this yesterday, crystallized pieces of a social substance that is einen gemeinschaftlich, which is, as I understand it, a very compact way of saying of crystallized pieces, quote unquote, of a quote unquote social substance, and that they consist of collectively, that is, values are crystallized pieces or made up of this substance collectively as a group. There couldn't be just one crystallized piece existing as value on its own. So this is the point of the crystallization. The crystallization is always social. It's not, crystal as in nature, that is, compressed over eons or whatever, coal compressed into diamonds, but rather a kind of formation that is a social formation. I think that's the more important point about what he means by crystal. So you can see that there's issues in the translation that can lead you astray in that sense. Since Marx replaced the term gemeinsam with gemeinschaftlich, that is common with collective or communal, and you can see that they're not identical. Things that are common are not collective or communal, and there's a subtle difference among these meanings. As he prepared the second edition of Capital for publication, it seems important to register the peculiarity of the latter word, that is gemeinschaftlich, which can also signify common. Now, common is really important because it without going into a big lexical thing, it is also about things that are held in common, that are owned in common, that are communicated in common, and that there is a kind of communitarian element that is sort of suggested by this idea that it's crystallized pieces of a social substance have that implication, they have that kind of semantic thing going on. Then there's the problem that translating it as common, quote unquote, yields a tautology. That if, as values, labor products all consist of the same substance, that substance has yet to be common to them all. It's not easy to say what exactly, the einen gemeinschaftlich means. Anyway, and another quote: the value of the new product incorporates, furthermore, that is, the thing that is, being transformed, commodity, et cetera, and money and blah 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 blah. Furthermore, the value equivalent of labor power plus the surplus value that arises. This result is due to the fact that labor power, remember we've talked about labor, the difference between labor and labor power before. The result is due to the fact that labor power sold for a determinate time, that is a day, a week, etc., has less value than its use produces in the same time. But by obtaining the exchange value of his labor power, the worker has alienated its use value. This happens in every purchase and sale of commodities. So when you go and buy something, you sort of crystallize, you reify, you kind of freeze, you know, value. It's no longer mobile. I mean, it is mobile in the sense that you started to exchange other equivalents like money, barter even. So some transformation has occurred in the exchange, but it's particularly in the question of what if you're selling your own artisanship in that sense. There's that difference. This particular article, labor power, is used to provide labor and thereby produce value. And this does not in any way change the general law of commodity production. If, therefore, the sum of values advanced in wages ends up in the product along with the surplus, this does not arise from an injury on the part of the seller, because he indeed receives the equivalent of his commodity, although from the consumption of it by the buyer. So, in other words, this is that thing you feel when you've made something and the other person, starts to use it or consume it or something, and you go, well, that's not the way you're supposed to do that. Or why haven't you appreciated that more or whatever? I mean, in other words, there's other things going on, more intangible elements. And you can't just sort of, say, well, it just, they don't matter because I think that their feedback, if you're an artisan of some kind, it's part of the audience or the relation, the feedback you get relative to your own production as an artisan. You go, oh, okay, they like that. Well, maybe I'll make some more of that thing, and so you see that the system of transactions, however uh, palpable in terms of getting money, or they give you a tip. um, Something else is going on, and you need to sort of account for it. And that's kind of what Marx is trying to do when he brings up this value form stuff. And maybe it's just because he didn't have enough examples, or that he didn't want to, sort of yammer on like I do. There are these things that happen, and unfortunately, in the history of Marxism, you have this kind of, as it were, a similar kind of compression or sort of melding of topics. So, for example, from Gramsci, and some of you may remember this from reading Gramsci, that there is the basic idea of base superstructure sort of is working as Gramsci writes his stuff. And he does this for a variety of reasons. I mean, he tries to create a space for cultural work, which is more in the superstructure, but is still connected via politics to economic elements. And what he's doing is a kind of interpretation of Marx that is, a necessary one. It fits with, a kind of predominance of the elements of Western Marxism, if nothing else. But it's also, you can see Gramsci. It's also writing during a time where he's trying to resist other things, like he's actually living under fascism. So you sort of kind of can identify with, why is all this stuff happening, and why can't we rid ourselves of these fascists? So anyway, number two in this is to show that there's a little bit of compression here. The ideological and political become more merged. This is often the popularity in the 1960s, where Althusser is talking about ideological state apparatuses, the so-called ISA. And the reason why he's talking about that is because he's trying to extend the notion of the superstructure and show that it's not kind of, elevated or elite or epiphenomenal or, unrelated to reality. He's trying to show that the ideological component, which was really kind of important for Gramsci, is more important when you go back and look at stuff and see, Oh, okay. Well, their ruling ideas are actually have some importance, and you can see this in well in the right. That's the whole Frankfurt School thing of well, how is it that fascism stuck around? It should have it should have disappeared, or should have sufficient resistance. At least from liberal democracy, should have gotten rid of it. Well, in the United States now it's sort of back, although some people get nervous when you say it. Anyway, number three is Poulantzas writes that, well, maybe the economic doesn't have to be quite so separate, in terms of extending these notions of talking about ideological state apparatuses. Now, the ideological state apparatus suggests, as with the superstructure argument, that there are a variety of things, including the state, religion, um, cultural institutions. There's a whole bunch of things that are ideological, and it's not, one thing, or it's not purely institutional in that sense. And so you have to sort of become more flexible and sort of see, well, crazy and wacky and stupid ideas become a mass idea. So, for example, the misinterpretation of the effect of various things, um, where the average whatever American overestimates the effect of certain things on in the political realm, that it's just that they assume that there're just more of them, and so even though they're only 1% of the total population of the U.S., or less than 1% are, for example, trans. Uh, the popular perception of it is that 21% of the total population is there. And you go, well, how is it that they believe that? And you can blame that on not only, right wing propaganda and, religious propaganda, but, you could blame it on, and I'm not doing that, there's just too much in the media on it, or it's sort of overrepresented. So, you could say RuPaul has made that, whatever, and that that's not a good argument, but it's an interesting one. And I'll just say that that's kind of, it fits into certain other elements, with all due respect. Um, the slur against Michelle Obama, blah 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 blah. So there's a lot of different little avenues to that kind of trope. Anyway, number four. Now, the fact that these can be seen as separate spheres, sort of brought on by Gramsci, but further developed in the 60s and 70s with the sort of re-examination of Marxist stuff. Laclau and Mouffe, say, well, let's ideological, political, and economic all kind of, merge together, and you need to sort of talk more generally about it. And one way to talk about it is as a system of formations, or a discursive formation. Now, I know that this is, a kind of splitting hairs, but ultimately, as the decades move, you begin to see a kind of criticism that becomes more lateral. And unfortunately, or fortunately, identity politics gets tied up in this. And now we can see with the current situation that the discursive formation has been sort of hijacked, and so that's and if you look at the discourse of, for example, centrist Democrats, that they're totally bailing on this, and actually picking up the tropes from the right wing, and it's just a little too damn scary that that's kind of what's happening. Reactionary things are happening. Okay, so without trying to get too complicated, it is a problem of what counts as subjective and objective. I mean, ultimately, it goes back to all the things that Marx is trying to deal with. And what I'm trying to introduce is the idea that not only do we have things that seem to me more intangible, um, the cinematic sign, for example, things that you see in media um, say a certain thing, whatever that means. And you have to sort of work through the interpretation, become more critical or more aware, which a lot of people aren't. And so you go through a series of I take this one. This is somebody else's diagram, but it shows the sort of expansion of, and this is what some people might refer to as Stuart Hall might refer to as articulation. Um, I don't know if that's the best way to explain it, but there is ways in which you can extend the analysis to provide for other kinds of effects and ultimately come back to a kind of class position. We don't have time to rattle through that here, but I do want to suggest, and this is where the Grimus square comes in. A.J. Grimus has a model that is a decent model. It's not a profound model. It's just a slight development. It's a tweak from the kind of French structuralism that comes all the way from Saussure, de Saussure, in terms of linguistics, but it has a weird path and goes through Claude Levi-Strauss and a bunch of other folks. The point is that we connect language to culture, and then in this particular diagram, space and time are kind of related to it. Well, in this particular case, space. That is, when you refer to, and every language has this, right? They're kind of spatial, indicators. Here, as in French, ici, here, or there, là-bas, you know, and this signifies a whole bunch of different things. It's actually pretty important. Go here, go there, and but the point is, in a structural model, for every there, there's a not there, a palaba, and for every here, there is a not here. The point is that there's a kind of, and this goes right back to Marx, etc., Hegel, negation, right? That you build into your logic, your everyday logic. The fact is that for every presence you kind of talk about, there are things, there are differential things. There's difference. For everything you foreground, there's background. There's stuff, context. If you want to oversimplify it, but the fact is that there's always context. There's never not context. Let's put it that way. And in fact, this idea is obviously to parse it, more, slice it out a little more in a more complex way, so you can have more specific contradiction, but you could have something that's, sort of contrary, which is not identical to a contradiction. It's something that is sort of not purely contradictory or pure negation. And then there's something that is, in other words, you could merge things or, sort of associate things. They have sort of an affinity. On the other hand, there is the contradiction. It's, this major negation. And then there's something called uh, a complementary relation. So it's a kind of subtlety in how you make the kind of connected context. And language is like that. I mean, that's just how language works. Um, so multiple features are possible. And the fact that you have these differences also indicates you just have a certain kind of, presence and absence and a kind of a tension because of the not having some things present and some things not present. And I know that can make life very complicated, but in fact, we make those kinds of decisions in our everyday life. We make really fast decisions on whether we're in danger or not. It's the same kind of decisions, and I would assert that the same kind of decisions that we make when we're driving, for example, because we're doing it at fairly high speed, and we make a lot of decisions sometimes with mistakes, and many of them are innocent on the one hand, or on the other hand, they're devastating or accidental, and that's the problem of the semiotic universe is that for example, idiots who signal left that they're going to make a left turn in the car and suddenly make a right turn, even though their blinker is making you go, what the hell was that? You this kind of stuff happens, and you get into an accident or something as a result. That makes it even more all crazy. So, in other words, there's a set of conventions that you assume. That's kind of why we, take a driver ed, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so the semiotic square, this Greimas semiotic square, is a way of extending the analysis of meanings by increasing the number of analytic classes around which some initial focus, that is the assumption of Saussure, is that meaning will, in fact, exist as part of a semantic field articulated through difference. Kind of how we get down the street is that, you know, uh, the basic difference goes all the way down to, you know, the housefly, in fact, negotiates by difference. That is, by distinguishing between edges, things that are solid, things that are not solid, things that are moving. It's why we have fly swatters. Um, that they, even with multiple eyes, they have to, they make all of these decisions fairly quickly. But it is, of course, much more habitual. It's not like they're making conscious, fly-like decisions unless they're Jeff Goldblum, you know, uh, or David Hedison, help me, in the movie The Fly. Anyway, it's usual to begin with the identification of contrary meaning. For example, starting with the familiar contraries of life and death, the square makes explicit the possibility of such curiosities as life and death. And then zombies are, of course, a contradiction, and neither life nor death, ghosts. So, without getting into a thing on the cultural meaning of, zombie films and The Walking Dead, blah 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 blah, and ghost films and hauntology and all that shit. Uh, anyway, what you can see is that there are analytic categories that can be created, and they have logical things. And it goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle has a logical square that does things that are, things that are not, things that are, that talk about action. That is, things that you're able to do, things that you're able not to do. And then you can see in the cross, and where they cross is that there is something called not being able not to do, which is a submission, which is submission, and not being able to do, which is powerlessness. And so we're making this kind of subtle distinction, but in fact, the subtlety of a submission powerlessness thing is what Trump is doing right now. It is, he's trying to sell people on more independence when in fact it's really more about submission. It really is about, power, humiliation, um, domination, all of those things. So the things that post-structuralism or a variety of post-World War II ideas is to go, oh, okay, in modern capitalist society, it's a lot more subtle and much more problematic. And without going into a long thing on this, it's just, at the mass level, it's not as easy as sort of, Gramsci might have it. It's like, in sort of the later or post-Freudian kind of things, we've got kind of mass psychosis at work. And lest you think I'm kidding, I would assert that the last results of our election are exactly that. And I don't think I'll get in a fight with too many people on that. And there's a literature for it, and it's not what we're going to do right now. But you can see that their contrariety is this dotted line here. Contradictory is the diagonal lines, and complementary is the vertical line. Now, this is very artificial, but what it allows us to do is to include sort of, uh, negation terms and then supplementary terms in the kind of logic, so that you have a little bit of slippage that, and with respect, this is how most of us manage to negotiate our place in the world, is so we can't do everything by sort of nice little absolutes, but rather by, this sort of differences that we have to sort of negotiate. And often, we screw up or whatever. And some people aren't very good at it, and hence they're very afraid. They're just afraid, the other, that they're darker or whatever, taller, shorter, or whatever. So anyway, now these relations can be, the Greimas just gives us one way of thinking about it. I mean, there's a bunch of other ways to do this, and If you spend too much time in sociology classes, there are just far too many stupid models out there. But the point is that you can see certain sets of oppositions that are kind of interesting. In this particular version, um, sort of exterminism or extremism, individualist extremism is at one end of our square. The other polarity on the axis here is communism. On the left is socialism. On the right is rentism. You can see that these are, like most semiotics, you don't have these kind of absolute terms. You can sort of fiddle around with these differences. Um, Scarcity and hierarchy. Hierarchy on the diagonal here. Hierarchy and equality or democracy are antagonists in that particular sense. Just like scarcity and abundance are on this diagonal a kind of contradictions in that sense. So here's another way to use the square. And the square's not perfect. You can move all the variables around if you really are. It just is a way of thinking about this stuff. So you can say that the postmodern sprawl in the city is like that, or something more neutral, or freedom of nature, or whatever is on the opposite here. On the right is the cultural. On the left is the material. On the diagonal here is country, that is rurality or whatever, nature. And on the other end is a critique of the country, that is what exists in the context of Trumpism, for example, anti-modernism, resistance, the critique of authenticity, anti-foundationalism, anti-essentialism, all this kind of stuff is there. Or the city on this diagonal and the critique of the city. And lest you think that's unimportant, it's pretty clear that that's in the Trump tropes are the city of devastation, and Trump just made up all this, just lied. Cities are terrible. There's too much crime. Immigrants are criminals, and when you actually look at the empirical data, it's just not true. I mean, there's not even a. It's just not true. Crime is. He says crime is rampant. Well, homicide is declining. There may be more property crimes, but that not quite the same thing. So anyway, similarly, in the Grimos sense, you can juxtapose Fordism and welfare on one end, and neoliberalism and post-Fordism on the other, which is the kind of real, sort of problems of complementarity in the real world. You have a powerful state, but you also have people who believe that a free market exists, which it doesn't. So there's always that contradiction. And of course, the vertical contradiction between the capitalist mode of production and something socialist, often seen as imaginary. So anyway, so these things exist, and I put in maybe too many of them, but you can look them up and not get too crazy about it, I hope. The point is, and as I mentioned before, you can say, sort of not with Grimus, but Grimus can be used. He's not the answer by any means. It's just that the methodology of layering various surfaces of meaning, I think, are pretty important. So Grimus suggests placing semiotic squares of associated meaning on top of one another to create a layered effect, and another form of analysis and interpretation. So that's kind of what's going on. I've just shown you several different ways in which the square doesn't always have to be in the same position. You can sort of pivot it, et cetera, as you layer things. And then, according to Grimos, the semiotic square is the elementary structure of signification, marking off the oppositional logic that is at the heart of both narrative progression and semantic, thematic, or symbolic content. In other words, you can take this and look at cinematic narrativity this way, which a lot of people do. It's how Lacanian analysis is applied to film studies, for example. The semiotic square has proven to be an influential concept not only in narrative theory, but in the ideological criticism of Fred Jameson, who uses the square as, quote, a virtual map of conceptual closure, or better still, of the closure of ideology itself. Now, there's a lot to go there, but Jameson tries to move the conception of ideology further on from the Althusserian position. I mean, most of his major stuff in his theoretical work in his early career was about Althusser, amongst many other things. Diegesis, a narrative time-space continuum. To borrow a term from Star Trek, the diegesis of a narrative is its entire created world, and any narrative includes the diegesis, whether you're reading science fiction, fantasy, mimetic realism, or psychological realism. However, each kind of story will render that time-space continuum in different ways. The suspension of disbelief that we all perform before entering into a fictional world entails an acceptance of the story diegesis. That's kind of what happens when we watch Twilight Zone, for example. The Star Trek franchise is fascinating for narratology because it has managed to create such a fully realized and complex diegetic universe that the narratives of all 5 TV shows, well, this is before, of course, this is written before Discovery, Picard, all the other later J.J. Abrams stuff. So TNG, DS9, SDV, Enterprise, original Star Trek, all are, you know, sort of interlocked in lots of ways. They share characters, they share narratives, they share timelines or anti-timelines in the same way. And all the movies occur, indeed, coexist within the same diegetic time space. Yes and no, and can argue that. And the J.J. Abrams universe is blah, 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 blah. And I'm not enough of an aficionado to get into that argument because it doesn't matter that much to me, but it serves as a very useful example of the kind of sort of layering and interlocking kind of ideas that go on. An important event in one of the movies affects all of the other shows and films in the franchise. So you have certain continuities that are, or discontinuities that occur. And my favorite example, of course, is Trouble with Tribbles in the original series, and the intervention that's made during what is it, DS9, on and that redoes the Tribble narrative or whatever. And
Yes, that's correct.
sorry,
That's correct.
yes. So that's my favorite example because it does all of the things that I just said. So I didn't even get to where my God. Let me see. Well, I've reached the end of my rope here, and maybe I'll do this tomorrow before we do after hours. Let me just suggest to you that tomorrow for Dis and Dat, I will be talking about this section, which is on, it's a 2016 article on Ferruccio Rocinante uh, by Giorgio Borelli. And it makes the assertion that I made at the beginning of this yakking about what is it that makes allows a material sign, or what are the considerations we would make if we would talk about the kind of material reality of a sign, and why is that useful for us in a Marxist context? Is to say, okay, we got money burning a hole in our pocket, or we don't. We have a credit card. Um, that this is the commodity form, and the money commodity form are just material examples of ultimately the same issue about capital. That is, if you have a credit card, for example, it is about capital. And so all of these interconnections have a certain materiality to them. Now, whether you're going to measure them in, sort of congealed labor units, that's where it gets stupid and ugly. But you do know that there is action or activity going on, and that at an abstract level, certain things are, transforming, turning over, evolving. I think there's a variety of words that you can use to show that there is a kind of mapping of activity, and you can do this in a variety of ways. You can use network analysis, you could use a variety of other things. You could say, well, that's pretty real to me. And certainly those of us who like watching detective stories, process crime shows and stuff, cop shows is interesting because, in fact, that's kind of what's being made material in a deductive way, and that is, well, how do all the clues line up, and and then of course the real problem is sort of meta issues of, well, hell, we didn't have any clues for that. Why are they dropping that in? Well, they want to get to the the next commercial, or they want to end the episode or end the narrative or whatever. And so um, material things are made. I mean, this is not immaterial in that particular sense. It's not epiphenomenal. That actually they require lots of interlocking and stuff like that. And in the at larger scales, it's merchandising, taken advantage of course, by um, that is that stupid people are being taken advantage of by other people who can con them into stuff like $10,000 guitars or stupid red hats or NFTs, uh, trading cards, uh, gold tennis shoes, whatever. Anyway, I've reached the end of my rope as usual, and catch you later, Joe. There any other questions, brickbats, interventions, commentary?
I have a question
Sure.
about diegesis. So that diegesis is a term that includes the whole universe of whatever subject you're talking about. But so outside that is the exegesis, correct?
Yes.
And so this gets used a lot in analysis of gravity's rainbow.
Yes.
And so is the exegesis, or is there like a membrane between the two? And if they interact, doesn't the diegesis
membranes? Yeah, membrane's actually a good analogy or metaphor.
So doesn't that just make the diegesis larger if it interacts with the outside world?
Yes.
That's why I always get confused.
Well, it's a complex structure. I mean, and the only way that you establish this, of course, is by, how is it that it's where they interface or whatever.
Right. So it's kind of like a balloon. It's maybe getting larger and smaller.
Yeah, but it's like a balloon animal. It's more like a balloon animal than it is a
balloon sculpture.
Okay. No, truly, I'm not being flippant about it. I do think that the kind of way in which we shape the narratives is sort of that way. And if you've seen that one episode on the narrative train in Rick and Morty, it's quite fascinating because it sort of plays with that idea. In other words, there's like a segment in it where the only way we can proceed, Morty, is if we do a if we propose if you propose a narrative. Rick is talking to Morty of a Bechdel and an example of feminist narrative that follows the Bechdel rule. Where women have to be talking to each other without having any male involved, and and so they do a whole little riff there on, you know, um, alternative narratives. Anyway, sorry. It's only me that happens to like cartoons.
No, Rick and Morty is brilliant.
I think it's quite cool. I mean, I think that Harmon, who does the show, is a little tied up with very specific filmic narrative structure and cinematic narrative. So he doesn't quite allow for, I mean, they're wacky, but he doesn't move it to the next level, which would probably lose the audience. So whatever.
Yeah, it reminds me a little of The Orchid Thief, where where the movie you're watching is being written as you're watching it.
Oh yes, 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 absolutely, absolutely. There are a couple of movies that are like that, and then there's the experimental films. Well, anyway, and then there's surrealist films that do that as well, or references to surrealist film, whatever. Anyway, but we digress.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention. I will stop share.